My name is Susan Jackson, and I'm a member of the Westmont Foundation Board. And on behalf of the Westmont Foundation Board and the Westmont professors, we are so glad you came out tonight. You are in for a very special discussion. Our next Westmont Downtown series is on Thursday, November 7th. So normally Tuesday nights, but this one is on Thursday, November 7th at 5:30. And the topic is Making Sense of the Me Too Moment, an institutional and cultural perspective. So come out. And now I have the distinct honor to introduce Dr. Mark Sargent, the Westmont Provost, and he in turn will introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Sargent assumed the role of Provost at Westmont College in the spring of 2012. He is a graduate of UCSB and earned a master's degree and a doctorate in English at Claremont University, specializing in American literature. He has a long and distinguished career in higher education. He came to Westmont after working 16 years as provost of Gordon College in Massachusetts. And for Dr. Sargent, Westmont is a family matter. For his wife, one of his sons, and his daughter attended Westmont. Please welcome Dr. Mark Sargent.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for coming out for our first of this series of lectures, and you should be in for a treat tonight. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Paul Willis, though I suspect that many of you in this room know Paul. He's been a familiar presence throughout Santa Barbara, as a friend to many of us, as a professor of English at Westmont, as a hiker, a trail builder, an essayist, and a poet. He joined the English department at Westmont in 1988, and he served as poet laureate of Santa Barbara from 2011 to 2013. And he still regularly organizes poetry readings around town. His love of the natural world, his capacity to find moments of joy, irony, pathos, and wonder in the outdoors really fills his poetry. All of this makes him a delightful companion, whether you're walking with him on a trail or listening to him read his works, as we will hear this evening. There's so much that I admire about Paul. He has a gentle, unpretentious spirit. I really admire his colloquial, authentic voice as a writer. He has a continual interest in promoting and supporting the work of his students. There's so many of our students who have found confidence to attempt their own poems and to read them in public because of Paul's guidance. I've also enjoyed working with Paul as a colleague. I've been on a couple of faculty searches with Paul, and I still remember, Paul, one question you asked a writing candidate or English candidate: do you like sentences? I love that question. In an era where there's so much focus on the ideological and the big picture, he wanted to know if this person really liked the craft of writing. Paul loves sentences. As you will hear tonight, Paul has deeply held principles about education as a source of discovery and wonder. Provosts get asked lots of difficult questions by faculty, and Paul's very good at that. But few do so with such a fine blend of discernment, genuine conviction, and gracious respect. He's a prolific writer. His poems appear in numerous magazines and journals, and he has many collections, including Say This Prayer into the Past, Rosing from the Dead, Visiting Home, Getting to Garditsky Lake, and most recently, Little Rhymes for Lowly Plants. His book of creative nonfiction, Bright Shoots of Everlastingness, Essays on Faith in the American Wild, includes essays and reviews. He's also published a 4-part eco-fantasy novel called The Alpine Tales. And his latest collection of essays, from which he will read tonight, is called To Build a Trail. And there are copies available for you to purchase at the back. This is an honor system. You can simply take a book and put the money at the back or give it to me. When Paul's book first came out, he gave me a copy on a Friday afternoon. I got up Saturday morning, started reading, and did not stop reading until I had finished. I trust tonight you'll discover some of the reason why. Please welcome Paul Willis.
Thank you so much to the Westmont Foundation and to the college and to you, Mark. We're very fortunate to have you as provost, and I wish I were as gracious a person as you've made me out to be. I'll try tonight. This will be a reading, and thank you all for coming. This will be a reading, not a lecture, maybe a few comments. As Mark mentioned, this most recent collection of essays came out to build a trail, essays on curiosity, love, and wonder. They're mostly personal, mostly narrative essays, what we would call creative nonfiction. And I'll read a handful of them. This summer, Sharon and I became grandparents. That makes me a grandfather to twin boys, actually. So it happened all at once for us. I found as the date of birth of the twins approached, I was a little reluctant for it to happen because I thought when I became a grandfather I would be officially old, and I wasn't so sure I wanted to be old in that way, but there's a lot of recompense. It's worth it. So I wanted to start with an essay about my own grandfather, and I've thought more about him now that I've arrived at this stage of life. And the essay actually begins with a poem. So the overall essay is called "The Shirt on Our Backs," but the poem with which the essay begins is called "Common Ground." Today I dug an orange tree out of the damp, black earth. My grandfather bought a grove near Anaheim at just my age. Like me, he didn't know much. "How'd you learn to grow oranges, Bill?" friends said. "Well," he said, "I look at what my neighbor does and I just do the opposite." Up in Oregon, he and his brother discovered the Willamette River. They were both asleep on the front of the wagon. The horses stopped. His brother woke up. "Will," he said, "am it a river?" Okay. My grandfather, he cooked for the Army during the war, the first one. He flipped the pancakes up the chimney. They came right back through the window onto the griddle. In the Depression, he worked in a laundry during the night, struck it rich in pocket knives. My grandfather, he liked to smoke on his orange grove as far away on the property as he could get from my grandmother, who didn't approve of life in general, him in particular. Smoking gave him something to feel disapproved for, set the world back to rights. Like everyone else, my grandfather sold his grove to make room for Disneyland. He laughed all the way to the bank, bought in town, lived to see his grandsons born, and died of cancer before anyone wanted him to. Absent now in the rootless presence of damp black earth. Growing up, my brothers and I shared and thus fought over an olive green wool shirt with clumsy buttons. It was our grandfather's from the First World War, and thus a prize. But it was also very scratchy and so more often admired than worn. Also, it was too big for any of us. Our grandfather was a Fleischmann whose parents came from East Prussia, where many of his 15 brothers and sisters had been born. They emigrated in part to avoid the draft under Bismarck, and now here they were, farming in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, and called up to fight against the speakers of their native tongue. I don't believe our grandfather made it past Fort Lewis in Washington, mustered in and mustered out before he could be shipped overseas. Still, the olive green shirt held a kind of romance for all of us. We put it on to play army in the woods and later on to backpack in the rain and snow of the Cascades. By the time we were through with it, oversized and scratchy as it may have been, the shirt had become a tattered rag. I think the shirt also attracted us because we had not really known our grandfather. He died when the oldest of us was not yet 5 years old. Even so, my earliest memory, before even the age of 2, concerns him. In the living room of our grandparents' home in Anaheim, California, our grandfather had a favorite chair, a green stuffed rocker, dark green, as I recall, and not overstuffed, but lean and scuffed, with a worn white doily at the head. During one particular family gathering, he left the room briefly, and I crawled up into the dark green chair by myself. When he came back, he made a generous to-do about my being in his place, and I became the center not only of his attention, but also of the entire room's. I wonder now if my climbing into my grandfather's chair and my wearing of my grandfather's shirt were each an attempt to become this person who must have been so kind to us all. In her most recent birthday card to me, my 89-year-old aunt wrote that a few days after her father had died, I walked over to that green chair and looked at its emptiness and confusion, and that the sight of this made everyone else very sad. Knowing him in my bones then, but not really knowing him, I have been an eager collector of stories about my grandfather. Some of these I put in the poem Common Ground. The poem begins with an anecdote about his moving to Anaheim to cultivate an orange grove. "How'd you learn to grow oranges, Phil?" friend said. "Well," he said, "I look at what my neighbor does, and I just do the opposite." So matter of fact, so self-effacing, and yet there is a definite self being asserted. Long after I wrote this poem, my aunt told me another story. Soon after they had arrived in Anaheim, one Sunday when the morning service had just let out and people were talking amiably on the steps of the church, a man happened to say he'd heard that up in Portland they rolled up the sidewalks every evening at 6 o'clock. "I wouldn't know," my grandfather said. "I was always in bed by then." Our grandfather had moved to Anaheim because he had married a girl from there, an Urbicite, and she had nagged him until he agreed to bring their family out of the rain in Oregon and back to Southern California. This was during the Depression, and once they got there, the 10-acre orange grove wasn't enough to support them. So he worked for a laundry during the nights and, in his optimistic way, struck it rich in pocket knives. But they didn't completely escape the rain. One winter, the torrents came and the house flooded, and he carried his children, one at a time, waist deep through the orange grove to higher ground. Perhaps that is the image I like best, a little like those 19th century paintings of Jesus carrying the lambs in his bosom. Is it possible that our parents and grandparents still carry us, still enfold us in their arms long after they're dead and gone? My mother, who made that trip across the brown floodwaters in his embrace, has now crossed that final flood by herself, and sometimes I feel that my brothers and I are left here in the rapids alone, trying to carry the ones who have in turn been entrusted to us. But that grim feeling ignores the fact that in having been carried, we still are carried in memory, if not in actual, tangible presence. The olive green shirt, though worn to rags, still rests upon our shoulders, and the dark green chair, though empty, is full. I want to say that if that essay works at all, it got you thinking not about my grandfather, but about your grandfather. And I think that's the paradox of particularity, I call it. So your grandfather might not have sat in a green scuffed rocking chair with a doily, but I hope you're picturing the chair that he did sit in. So what's an essay? It's a way of inquiring, of connecting. I started out writing novels. And then I think Perry Longo here in town got me writing poems. But I think it was my former colleague Heather Spears who sat me down and said, don't ignore the essay. Just because we're grading them all the time and complaining about them doesn't mean there's not a lot of room to roam. And essays are fun to write. It comes from a French word, I think, essay. It means, and our word assay is related. It means to try, to attempt, to test. So an essay is an attempt to know, an attempt to understand, and evaluate for that. So I'm trying to connect with a grandfather I hardly knew through what I wrote. And I think, curiosity, love, and wonder always take circuitous paths towards understanding what is an essay, if not a circuitous path. Well, this next one, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of someone saying something to you in a rather pointed fashion, and ever after you try to make sense of what they said. What was it? What was it they were really saying to me? What was it? So this essay is called the Garrison Keillor koan, and if you're not familiar with that word koan, it's a Buddhist term. It's a riddle or a puzzle, and there's really no answer to the riddle, but in concentrating on the riddle, you're supposed to come to some degree of enlightenment. That's the idea. So the Garrison Keillor koan. Every once in a while, Garrison Keillor came to town to deliver one of his trademark monologues. There he would be, alone on stage in his dark suit and flaming red socks, meandering from story to story and leading us both at the beginning and near the end in a medley of old folk tunes and hymns. How did he do it? Spinning those tales ad infinitum out of his head? I could not tell. The man was a gentle genius. Of course, my wife and I had listened to him on the radio for nigh unto 40 years. He was as much a part of our marriage as anyone or anything we could remember. A prairie home companion mixed with baking smells in our kitchen on Saturday afternoons. And Sharon in particular started almost every morning with a 5-minute visit to the writer's almanac. One Sunday morning, she insisted I listen too, even though we were late for church, and very impatiently I consented, wading through a list of birthdays of this author and that author before being completely blindsided by a reading of one of my own poems. Actually, it was the one I read you about my grandfather. So the last time he came to Santa Barbara on a rainy winter afternoon, we made the trip down to the old theater to see what he was up to now. It was the weekend of the inauguration of Donald J. Trump, but that turned out to be too much of a fat pitch. He didn't mention Trump at all, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The surprise of the afternoon for us was that when we walked into the foyer, just 10 minutes before the show, Garrison Keillor was standing by the door to the theater proper, relaxed as can be, just chatting with a few folks. So I thought, well, this is our chance to say hello, and after waiting our turn, we did. Garrison Keillor is an extremely tall man, and when he gave us his attention, He did so from on high, it seemed. And too, there was something paradoxical about the way he looked at us, making concerted eye contact and yet not making eye contact at all. But we quickly introduced ourselves, and I thanked him for reading that poem of mine. He wanted to know which one it was, and I described it, but he couldn't bring it to memory. I told him I taught creative writing at Westmont College just up the hill, and at the beginning of most of my classes I played the Writer's Almanac, and that the students were especially interested, inspired even, by the stories he told about how people became writers. Instead of saying, "Thank you," or "That's nice to know," he broke in and said with an oddly definite emphasis, "You beat up on those kids. Beat up on them." I must have laughed, thinking he was making a joke, but he leaned in hard and said it again, his eyes and voice quite serious. "You beat up on those kids." And again, a fourth time, "Beat up on them." And then he was gone, whisked away by the theater host to reappear just moments later on the stage. And I was left to wonder, as I have since, what exactly he meant to tell me. There may have been some clues in the opening moments of his monologue. He told about a niece of his, real or imagined, who had gotten pregnant and given birth, how he and his wife had taken them in, both the young woman and the baby. The father of the child was a graduate student who couldn't quite make up his mind about taking on his new responsibilities. Once in a while he came for dinner, but the fellow hardly ever spoke up, and when he did, it was only to mumble. "Diction!" Garrison Keillor thundered. Here was a young man who couldn't speak, who couldn't write, and yet was on the point of gaining a master's degree in communications. As for his niece, her lips and cheeks and nose and ears had so many piercings that she looked as if she had tripped and fallen face first into a tackle box. And so it went. The first half hour of the monologue was spiced with similar trash talk about hapless failings of hapless millennials, of whom there were very few in the room. Could it be, I wondered to myself, could this man I had thought of for most of my life as a genial uncle actually be in his heart of hearts a cranky old man? Was I simply being deputized, since I still had some influence, since I was still in the classroom, to take revenge on a whole generation of shifters and slackers? Certainly, there was nothing to gain by simply being mean to students. I did not want to be mean to my students. Of course, I wanted to hold them accountable, and I thought I did. And perhaps that's all he had meant. Perhaps he had wanted to remind them that writing is very hard work, not simply a matter of being inspired. Or maybe he really had been kidding, both with me in private and with his audience in public. Which was it? Humor can be so slippery. But if I had been given a mandate, not an over-the-top pleasantry, what was it exactly, and how could I possibly carry it out? Sharon's theory was that Garrison Keillor is the kind of person who doesn't tolerate compliments. On the way home, she said, "Remember when he was on the phone with Barack Obama last summer? The phone call during his last show, and Obama praised him for all those years on A Prairie Home Companion. He couldn't just say thank you. It's like he wanted to change the subject. You were saying something nice to him, and he couldn't take it. He turned it right around on you." My wife is very good that way, socially observant. But if he were just deflecting a compliment, why deflect it so hard and so long and in just that way? The next morning, I told my fiction writing students what Keillor had said, and that turned out to be a mistake. I tried to turn it into a lesson about the many complications and contradictions inherent in human character. They just winced at me, perturbed. A few days later, I told my provost, and he just laughed. Keeler's a quick study, he said. It only took him a few moments of conversation, and he had you pegged for a patsy in the classroom. Now it was my turn to wince. 2 months later, I told my story to a poet-teacher friend who had spent some time with Garrison Keillor. What you have to know, she said carefully, is that Garrison Keillor is very funny on stage, but not that funny in person. She thought what he had said to me was very strange, but was probably an expression of an actual frustration of his. Her brow was furrowed as she spoke. No one really teaches by beating up on people, she said. That never works. So I think about this little koan that Garrison Keillor dropped in my lap. In spite of all the exegetical help I've received, I haven't come to enlightenment yet. And sometimes I wish he had never told me what he told me, for the only person I have beat up on subsequently and consequently is myself. But now I wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was merely a matter of transference. Donald Trump had just become our president 2 days before. Garrison Keillor had decided not to say a word about it that afternoon, but his sadness and anger had to land somewhere, and why not on the next generation, the very ones who needed to become good and caring and wise enough to avoid what he regarded as good and caring and wise enough to avoid repeating what he regarded as the national mistake we had just made. They needed to be taught well and fast. If that's all that was behind his prompting, his strangely urgent exhortation, I'm fine with it. But I would prefer to walk softly and not carry somebody else's big stick. I don't know. Do you have some ideas? I'm open. I'm open. It's probably never a good idea to meet our heroes in the flesh. So, well, another person I admire that I have met and did get to know a little bit in the last years of his life was the pastor, writer Eugene Peterson. And you may know Eugene Peterson was a biblical scholar, very familiar with ancient languages, but felt the call to be a pastor. And I think what resulted from that mix, his scholarship and his service with ordinary people, was his well-known paraphrase of the scriptures called The Message, which became very popular. I had the good fortune to be part of a writers group with him that met annually for a weekend, and we'd talk about our next writing projects. I still remember his saying, well, I don't know what I'm going to do next. I've done the Bible. and he was completely sincere. So anyway, maybe inspired by Eugene, I thought maybe I would try my own biblical paraphrase. So I want to read an essay called The Sixth Chapter of Acts, and if you don't recall that particular one, that's when there's a dispute about whether the Hellenist widows are being cared for properly, and then the apostles appoint a group to take care of this, and the outstanding member of that group is Stephen, remember, and he starts doing signs and miracles, and by the end of the chapter he's been arrested and on his way to becoming a martyr. But here's my version, the 6th chapter of Acts. Now during those days, when the disciples were increasing in number, The Hellenists complained against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. And the 12 called together the whole community of the disciples and said, "Please take a few moments of your time to fill out this important survey." And the survey was given, and the survey was taken, and 86.5% of the disciples completed the survey. Then said the 12, "It appears that 13.5% of the disciples have not filled out this important survey. They shall be called outliers and shall be taken where they do not wish to go." And the 13.5% fell down and died. And great fear seized all who heard of it. And the young men came and wrapped up their bodies, then carried them out and buried them. Then said the 12, "It now seems good to us to select a consultant to interpret the results of this important survey. A commission of 7 will be appointed to evaluate the merits of the various consulting agencies available and then to report back to us. For it is not right that we should neglect the word of God in order to wait upon survey results." What they said pleased the remaining 86.5% of the community, and they chose Stephen, who was full of the spirit of his MBA, together with Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicolaus, a graduate of Antioch Polytechnic Institute. But once the 7 were named, a dispute arose among the 86.5% as to the cultural bias of the commission, for it was noted that all 7 were Hellenists and none were Hebrews, and that the Hellenists were bound to be prejudiced in their consideration of various consulting agencies in favor of their brother and sister Hellenists who had brought the original complaint. And the 12 said, "Let us form a commission of fairness in matters of cultural orientation, to which we may refer this matter, and let us call it the CFMCO for short." And so, a second commission of 7 was formed. 3 Hellenists, 3 Hebrews, and one who, as a result of an operation, was a resident of Transjordan. And after deliberation, fasting, and prayer, the CFMCO appointed themselves as a substitute commission for the evaluation of the merits of various consulting agencies for the eventual selection of a consultant to interpret the results of the important survey. And the CFMCO met regularly on alternate Tuesdays at a restaurant of their choice. And they recommended the Do Good, D-U-G-U-D, Do Good Consulting Agency located in Alexandria, and a collection was taken to fund the first-class round-trip galley fare for a consultant who arrived from Alexandria and insisted on 5-star accommodations. And many portions of food designated for Hebrew and possibly Hellenist widows were rerouted to provide 24-hour room service for the consultant. And the consultant said, "I would like to provide an overview of the results of your important survey, but unfortunately the instrument was poorly constructed and did not take into account the possible limitations of the respondents. So, after a farewell banquet with the CFMCO, the consultant returned to the port accompanied by the 12, and there was much weeping among them all. They embraced the consultant and kissed him. Then, before boarding his galley, the consultant declared in the hearing of all, "Before constructing a revised version of your important survey, you must first identify a measurable survey learning outcome that you would like to attain. In this effort, it is important not to be swayed by the merely aspirational. For example, do not hope to ascertain how many widows of which sort are receiving sustenance, for that is a subjective matter of some indeterminacy, as we do not live by bread alone. A much better starting place within the scope of your survey would be to quantify the exact number of Hellenist widows who eat with their left hands." This pleased the 12 greatly, and they made arrangements for the consultant to visit them annually in order to gauge their progress in attaining their measurable survey learning outcomes. They returned to Jerusalem emboldened to reconstruct their important survey in a way designed to attain data-driven decision-making for all future eventualities. The 86.5% greeted the 12 with joy, at which time the 12 excused themselves to an upper room for their weekly long-term planning retreat, during which they fine-tuned their survey instrument. At the end of their retreat, the important survey was given again, and it was found that the respondent sample of Hellenist widows had dwindled considerably, and none remained who ate with her left hand. Sorry, Eugene. Now, in case you're worried, that's not a parody of Scripture. It's in literature, it's called the mock epic device. So what's being made fun of is our self-important methods, which look trivial if they're reframed in the context of Scripture. It's not epic. It's not Scripture that's being mocked. I say that when I was a student at Wheaton College, which I heard a cheer back there, but I thought Wheaton just took itself way too seriously. And I published an article in the student paper. It was the Ten Commandments, and it began, I am Wheaton, thy college, thou shalt hold no other schools before me. And the president summoned me into his office and gave me a lecture about parodying Scripture, and then years later I found out, well, no, I didn't. I don't think I did. So a few years ago I was asked to write an essay about roses. You don't think that will happen after you finish high school and college, that you'll be assigned essay topics, but it happens, and sometimes it brings things out of you that you wouldn't otherwise know. So this little essay is called By Any Other Name. I have never been one to notice roses. I know the names of wildflowers by the score, particularly the alpine sort. And I love to sit in mountain meadows, counting petals and contemplating the sweet shine and attitude of shooting stars and Indian paintbrush. But roses are the poodles of the vegetable kingdom. Domesticated, fretted over, too precious for their own good. They have their uses, of course. When my mother turned 75, my brothers and I rustled up that many red roses and surprised her with them, a whole cartload. And my own lovely wife, Sharon, the Rose of Sharon, seems to appreciate a dozen or so on special occasions as proof of my unwilted love. And then there was the time in college that a beautiful and breathy young woman, 2 years my senior, received a dozen anonymously. Who could have sent these? She asked in my presence. And I, who had not sent them, stammered and blushed. And thus began a rather interesting few weeks until I was disastrously found out. My interest in roses took a turn some years ago, however, when Sharon and I lost our home to a wildfire on the outskirts of Santa Barbara and temporarily rented a place in town near the old mission. We jogged to the mission with our dog almost every morning, which also meant jogging past our spreading municipal rose garden. There is something about loss that dulls the senses. As I recall, our stomachs were knotted with the trauma of the fire, and life passed as a distant dream. But there is also something about loss that allows one to notice things. And what I noticed about these roses is that they had names, lots of names, announced for us on knee-high placards that lined the beds. Rainbow Knockout, First Light, Wind Chimes, Buff Beauty, Hot Cocoa, Bishop Darlington, Redcoat, Child's Play, Innocence. Nice, I thought. Some, of course, were a little much. Sunshine Daydream, Perfect Moment, Honey Perfume, Tahitian Sunset, Mellow Yellow, Over the Moon. Overlooking these, however, I began to take a certain delight in reading off the names aloud and repeating them as I bounced across the grass after our golden retriever. There was a literary flavor to some: Clytemnestra, Penelope, William Shakespeare, Wise Portia, Fair Bianca, the Dark Lady. And there was, of course, a whole French quarter: Duchesse du Brabant, Étoile de Lyon, Marie Van Haute, Monsieur Tillier, La Sylphide, and my favorite, Beauté and Constant. Since I had never bothered to learn French, I ran around the garden mispronouncing these in pig Latin as I pleased. Beauté inconstante. Music to my ears alone. Then there were the racier varieties: Playboy, Playgirl, X-rated, Sheer Bliss, Sweet Surrender, reminding me that of all flowers, roses may be the most suggestively erotic. Before there was first base, second base, third base, and home, there was the French medieval romance of the rose, the whole point of which was to penetrate the rose in the center of the walled garden. It is no surprise, then, that many of the roses were simply named after women, or vice versa. Rosaline, Kathleen, Felicia, Brandy, Kristen, Cynthia, these the approachable girls next door when compared to the distant Madame Lombard or Lady Anne Kidwell. A surprising number of roses were named after real or imagined goddesses of recent times: Betty Boop, Marilyn Monroe, Audrey Hepburn, Elizabeth Taylor, Barbara Streisand, Sweet Diana, Maria Shriver, Julia Child. Julia Child? I mean, I like her cooking. And some were even named after men, which I thought represented an almost complete failure of the imagination. William R. Smith, David Austin, Mr. Lincoln, Henry Fonda, Dick Clark. Please, I thought, Dick Clark may be many things, but he is not a rose. He has only faded like one. I have to give credit to one of our professors from France, Marianne Robbins, for helping me with the pronunciation, and I have Mary Collier here as a check. But, you know, the magic of individual names and words, we all have our favorite words. They're just fun to say. I think one of the worst things our grade school teachers ever did to us was insist that we start reading without moving our lips. Okay, you know, they robbed us of that physical pleasure of each word. I always think of Emily Dickinson. Her favorite word was gingerbread, and she would say, gingerbread. Now, there's a word to lift your hat to. Yeah. All right. Just a couple more very short essays. This one is another from our time, just the year we lived, just a few blocks from here, after the fire, after the tea fire. It's called, How Are You, My Friend? For the year after our house burned down in a tea fire, my wife and I rented a condominium near downtown Santa Barbara. Our block was a mix of gentrified complexes and broken down old homes. The street was shaded, the sidewalk buckled, and parking difficult to find. The condo had a roomy, covered front porch from which we could watch motorcycles motor by, but I don't recall that we sat down on that front porch all that often. Something about the trauma of the fire kept us restlessly pacing. Our son was just a year out of college and back home from Los Angeles to work in a law office a few blocks away. A lover of cars, he had just bought a used Audi wagon to haul his drums from gig to gig. The perfect set of wheels for that purpose, he said. Our daughter lived a couple miles away with some friends, finishing up her own last year of college. So this was our family, not counting the dog, which counted for a lot in those days. Years before, just after the 9/11 attacks, I took our dog to school for a week so the students could pet him during class. Similarly, in that year after the fire, our dog got a lot of attention, or we craved his. Right behind our condo was an old corner grocery store that had just been taken over by an immigrant family from Syria. It had become more of a liquor store, actually. The grocery part was fairly sad. The bananas were speckled, the ice cream was chalky, and the milk perpetually past date. It was a kind of grocery store we only went to when we needed something at the last minute. But in the evening, I would often walk the dog past the store and find the aging Syrian proprietor sitting calmly on the sidewalk, firing up a little stove to make some tea. Every time I walked by, he would call out, "How are you, my friend?" I would say I was fine and continue on. The proprietor had 2 sons who worked in shifts. They were about the age of my own. Unlike their father, they were full of hurry and energy, as if through sheer force of personality, their shabby corner grocery store could become the next Walmart. I often thought of them growing old in the fierce white light of those bottles of vodka behind the counter, their nimble hands passing change for packs of gum and packs of condoms. I wish that my students had half their hurry and energy. I wish that these 2 Syrian boys could go to college. Late one spring evening, 5 months after the fire, our daughter woke us up with a call. Our son had been in an accident in his Audi wagon, a very bad accident. He was in the emergency room and we should get there right away. When we found him behind a flimsy curtain, propped up in a bed and no longer conscious, he was still bleeding badly from a depressed skull fracture. He would need immediate surgery. Friends gathered through the night as he lay on the operating table, and then in the morning came word of likely recovery. I do not remember everything of the weeks that followed, but here is something I do remember. My wife stayed at the hospital for several days and nights running, and I went home from time to time to walk the dog. One evening, the dog and I passed in front of the corner grocery, and there was the old proprietor sitting calmly on the sidewalk, firing up his stove for tea. "How are you, my friend?" he said. I stopped this time. I could not say I was fine, for I was not fine. Suddenly, this Syrian man seemed to me the friendliest presence on the planet. I approached, and he very graciously arose. I told the dog to sit, and then I told the man about my son and his accident, about his crushed skull and his operation, and how in the morning he had quietly opened his eyes and spoken to us. A miracle. But I told him how worried we were still, how the outcome was in no way sure, how my wife was still at the hospital, and here I was, walking the dog. The Syrian man stood very quietly and nodded. He listened to every word I said. "That is very hard, my friend," he said. And then he said, Please, some tea, my friend. I'd like to think I accepted his offer, that he poured me some tea in a little cracked cup, that we sat quietly side by side and drank together in little sips, but I probably just thanked him and left. Night after night, however, I came back, walking the dog, and every time I passed by, if the Syrian father was sitting by the purr of his stove, he would call out, "How is your son, my friend?" And I would tell him, whatever the news might be, I would tell him, and my heart would well every time. My heart, that little cracked cup. Well, I'm reminded of that famous line in Virgil's Aeneid, there are tears in things. It's quite true of our experience. But Shakespeare says, give sorrow words. And we try to do that. Of course, Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. But we have to go through the mourning for the comfort, don't we? I wrote that story down after spending a weekend talking with a Palestinian-American poet, Naomi Shihab Nye, whom some of you know or have read. And we were talking about immigrants in the country and how they were being treated at the time. And I said, well, let me tell you this story. And I got choked up telling it to her, as I did reading it. And that's why I thought I should probably write it down. Middle Eastern immigrants are by and large not very welcomed in our country right now, but here they were welcoming me, and I marvel and rejoice in that. Well, I began the reading with an essay about my grandfather, and I want to end the reading with an essay about a grandfather clock. It's not in the book. It's an essay I wrote quite recently. It's being published in a magazine called The Crescent this month. And I want to thank you for being such patient, attentive listeners. Grandfather clock. My mother-in-law passed away a few months back and bequeathed to us a house full of dishes, knickknacks, and furniture. I don't fault her for that. She could be as contrary as any mother-in-law on earth, but in recent years she had sweetened up considerably, and it wasn't her intention to leave us with so many choices. In trip after trip, 7 hours each way, we winnowed the contents of her home. What made it somewhat interesting were the $100 bills she had hidden around the house in random vases and sock drawers. Treasure hunt! But mostly it was a slog. The plaster of Paris wide-mouthed frog went into the dumpster with his kin. The closet full of tasteful hats went to the local hospice thrift shop. The tools in the garage to a handy neighbor. Old novels to my students. Copper pots and pans to our daughter. The TV sound system to our son. The bronze end tables to consignment, and so on. But inevitably, several loads of armchairs, portraits, and miscellaneous paraphernalia were trailered home to our very own garage. Chief among these precious things was a grandfather clock that had been in the family since, well, long before my wife's grandfather made his appearance in swaddling clothes. The grandfather clock was an attractive old gent standing just a little higher than 7 feet. Tall enough for the NBA, but a bit too stationary to be effective in the playoffs. Its face was inscribed with its maker's name, John Barlow, and the place of its making, Oldham, a town outside of Manchester. I knew a pair of sisters in college with the last name of Oldham. They were from New Jersey, but their people must have been from England. One of them was very tall, and the other always on time. Coincidence? I think not. Using these clues, we sleuthed online and discovered our clock had been made around 1750 or so, at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, which we learned got some of its glimmer in Oldham itself, with steam-powered cotton mills that were engineered with the help of local clockmakers. Speaking of engineering, the liberal arts college at which I teach just added a major in mechanical engineering, a move I opposed because, quaint thought, I didn't think engineering was one of the liberal arts. Not that I have anything against engineers, especially ones with the last name of Barlow. But back to our clock, wrapped in plastic in our garage and lording it over all the other massed and huddling refugees from another time and place. Would it fit in the house somewhere? We inspected the walls and corners of each room, looking for a suitable spot, and alas, we found none. Even if we could squeeze it in somewhere, it would dwarf everything else in sight. Could we sell it then? It's an heirloom, said my beloved. It's been in the family. That would be so wrong. Besides, she added, the local antique dealer had said that grandfather clocks were not really in right now, and ours would fetch only a few $100s. That's when a friend happened to mention that our college administration building, a classy old structure that used to be a manor house, once had a grandfather clock in the hallway. That would be nice, my wife thought. We could give the clock away, but it wouldn't be going too far, since we live right next door to the campus, and since we have both worked at the college since time immemorial, we would almost be giving it to ourselves. So I sauntered over to the admin building and checked out the cream white foyer and hallway. Definitely not a good fit. The old wooden clock would stick out like a sore thumb, or more like a throbbing middle finger. Just off the hallway, however, was a high-ceilinged, wood-paneled parlor that plays host to our formal events. I don't know how many poetry readings I have arranged there over the years, introducing visiting writers in front of the marble fireplace. So I peeked inside, and in one corner of that roomy parlor, I spotted a very blank wall just begging for a grandfather clock. We made our offer, the college accepted, and one afternoon, on the stroke of 2, I found myself carefully loading the clock, like a coffin, into the back of a pickup truck for a solemn journey to its final resting place. Once installed, John Barlow's 18th century creation fit in the room with an unobtrusive dignity. The first people that happened in didn't even notice it, which we thought was just right. There was one problem, though. In rehanging the pendulum, I broke off a tiny flange at the top that steadies the motion of the thing. Instead of serenely rocking back and forth, the pendulum now banged crazily into the weights. Reluctantly, we brought it to a timeless halt and comforted ourselves by saying that we wouldn't want our visiting poets to be interrupted mid-poem by the tick-tock and the chiming hours. But that's not what my colleagues think. Don't worry, said one of our physics profs. Our mechanical engineering majors will have that going in no time.
How is your son?
Oh. You know, our son is pretty fully recovered, thank you. Yes, Loretta.
What was the word you used with Garrison Keillor? Coan?
Oh, K-O-A-N.
K-O-A-N.
K-O-A-N, you can look it up.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a Buddhist riddle that doesn't really have a solution, but working on the riddle is supposed to bring you enlightenment. It didn't work that way for me, but Dawn.
Where can we find the entrance to your trail being built in Westmont?
Okay, so the title of the book is To Build a Trail, and 14, 15 years ago, I put in a trail in, basically they're in the two creek beds that go through the Westmont campus, which of course can't be built in, and they drop about 30 feet to these intermittent streams, and they're full of poison oak and these wild areas. The Westmont campus is actually 111 acres, and I think most of them are actually wild. But the easiest place to access it is right behind the baseball stands there, and part of it goes up to Mountain Drive from there, and part of it goes down to Chellam Way, and then you can loop around to Chellam Creek on the other side of campus, and it makes a 1.5 mile loop. So, yeah. Yes.
Do you have another story about the author of the message?
Oh, another story about Eugene Peterson?
Yes.
Oh. Well, I should say he really was a saint. He's a man with a beautiful spirit, and just very encouraging to everyone he met. I mean, he actually listened to a few of these. I think he listened to the one about the 6th chapter of Acts. He wasn't all that approving, like Ben Patterson here. and I respect him for that. But the last time I saw him, I took a kind of formal farewell because I didn't want to presume, and he said no, and he took my hands in both of his. He says, "I know you. I know you." It's good to be known by one another. Yeah. Yes, Jonathan.
Did you ever recover from studying at Wheaton? More seriously, what would you really express in the way of gratitude for that school?
Oh, for Wheaton? Oh, a lot. Of course, my classmates and many of my teachers. I just, as a school, unfortunately, has a history behind it, and regards itself as the flagship school of evangelical Christian colleges, and we're human. Pride sneaks in, and it's not comely, that sort of thing. We're constantly being reminded that we are in the best place ever. I think Westmont has an appropriate humility. Oh, we have a lot to be humble about, but but no, I've been at Westmont for 32 years. I deeply value my colleagues and their excellence, really, but I don't, I like the way we wear it. Yeah.
Do you still get a lot of missionary kids?
Get a lot of what?
Missionary.
What kind of
Missionary.
Missionary kids at Westmont? We get some. What would you say, Mark?
We get some,
Mm-hmm.
we do a good number.
Yeah.
What has your own writing practice, how has it informed what you want to teach and pass along to your students?
I heard writing process. What was the last part?
How does that inform what you want to pass on to your students? What do you want them to walk away from when they leave your classroom?
Oh, students? Yeah.
In their hearts?
Well, I want students to experiment with writing process. If they're in the habit of writing at the last minute, encourage them to maybe start a little earlier. And I actually, these real responsible ones that start early, I say, try starting the night before, see what happens, And, if they only write on the computer, I say, try it by longhand, or vice versa. Or, if they like to write in coffee shops, I say, try going someplace quiet where you're alone, Yeah, Ben?
You told me a great story about what you saved when the T-fire came through.
Oh, right.
That's a very great story. Would you mind telling that?
Okay. I'm trying to think. I want to finish with C, and I will get to that story. Lately as a writing teacher, I try to get out of the way. It sounds odd, but they need to be self-sufficient, not just my hovering over them. And it's really beautiful to watch them, find their voice. And so I of course I give a little piece of advice, but I feel like mostly I cheer them on, and maybe I want to do what Eugene Peterson did for me. I want to say, I know you have something to give. So Ben's asking about what the tea fire was like for us. Like so many people, it came upon us very suddenly. We only had a few minutes to get out of the house. We knew where we were going. Sharon was a nurse at the college then, and the students were sheltering in the gym, and she was there. And I had a pre-assigned job of looking after the neighborhood dogs in the men's locker room. The cats were in the women's locker room. But we scurried around the house to try to get a few things, and I looked in my study, and what do I take? What do I take? And I had a whole stack of research from a year's sabbatical, handwritten notes and poems and things, but then there was a folder of freshman lit exams on my desk, and that's what I took. And so I graded those in the locker room, and when I handed them back, I said, "You'd better appreciate these." Thank you for coming.
Thank you.